The front gate was wide open when she arrived, and David Vance did not even notice her approach. He was standing with his back turned, meticulously repairing a section of the barbed wire fence that his cattle had aggressively pushed down the previous week. The rusted wire was coiled tightly around his heavy leather work gloves, and the blazing sun of 2 in the afternoon beat down mercilessly against the back of his weathered neck. This was precisely the kind of exhausting, grueling labor that he preferred nowadays, the sort of work that demanded his entire physical body and left absolutely no room in his crowded mind for anything else. Ever since his beloved wife Lauren had passed away 3 years ago, David had learned to effectively hide himself within the relentless chores of the ranch. He constantly told himself it was not an escape, but rather a sheer necessity of rural life, though deep down the silence of the valley often felt like a heavy weight he could never quite shake off. "Are you David Vance?" The clear, steady voice cut through the afternoon silence from behind him, causing him to turn around slowly, without any visible rush. He initially assumed it was some young, inexperienced ranch hand sent over by a neighbor, or perhaps the representative from the local agricultural cooperative who had vaguely promised to stop by later in the week. But as his vision adjusted to the glare, he realized it was neither of those expected visitors. A woman was standing approximately 5 meters away from him, holding a simple leather bag over her shoulder, her remarkably clear eyes fixed entirely on him, as if she already knew exactly who was standing before her. There was absolutely nothing lost in her direct gaze, nothing timid, and certainly nothing hesitant about her sudden presence on his property. David slowly pulled off his heavy leather glove from one hand, then from the other, deliberately taking his time before offering any kind of response. "Depends on who is asking," he replied in a rough, quiet tone, not out of inherent rudeness, but because life in the valleys of Montana had taught him to always be suspicious of unannounced visitors. In this rugged country, a guest who arrived without warning usually brought some form of complicated trouble or bad news. The woman did not seem deterred by his guarded, stoic demeanor. Instead, she took a small step forward, her expression remaining entirely composed and serious under the bright Montana sky. "Victoria Foster," she said simply, pronouncing her own name with a calm confidence that suggested the introduction alone should be more than enough. And in truth, it was because David recognized the name instantly, as nearly everyone in the Bitterroot Valley knew of the prominent Foster family. However, he had absolutely never expected to hear that specific name spoken on his own secluded ranch by this particular woman on a quiet Monday afternoon. He remained completely still for a moment, observing her intently, like a man waiting for the next shoe to drop, trying to discern what a woman of her standing could possibly want with a grieving, reclusive rancher. "I need to speak with you about something," Victoria said, her voice remaining steady despite the heavy atmosphere between them. "Something incredibly serious, but preferably not out here in the blistering sun like this. Could you possibly spare me a few minutes of your time?" David glanced over at the pile of gloves resting on the wooden fence post, looked back at the unfinished section of the perimeter fence that still required hours of hard labor, and then finally looked back at her determined face. "Follow me," he said bluntly, turning his back to her and walking with long, deliberate strides toward the main ranch house. He did not offer to carry her bag, he did not smile, and he refrained from making any of the polite gestures a man typically makes when a beautiful woman unexpectedly appears. It was not because he lacked manners, but because he had long since deactivated that social part of his soul, a realization that sometimes frightened him during the lonely, dark hours of the middle of the night. The wide front porch of the ranch house featured 2 worn wooden rocking chairs and a small side table where his elderly housekeeper, Nancy, always left a fresh pitcher of cold water and 2 clean glasses. Nancy did this because David had a frequent habit of bringing in tired ranch hands at the most unpredictable hours of the day for a quick respite. David poured a glass of water and silently offered her both the drink and one of the chairs. Victoria gratefully accepted the glass of cold water, but she declined to sit down, choosing instead to remain standing near the edge of the porch, staring out at the beautiful, rolling landscape before them. The green pastures sloped gently down toward the distant valley floor, and the black cattle were scattered across the hills like small, dark ink spots on a vast green canvas. "It is beautiful out here," she remarked softly, her eyes sweeping across the horizon before she turned her full attention back to the quiet man standing beside her. "What exactly did you come here to tell me?" David asked directly, completely bypassing her polite compliment about the land, unwilling to delay the true purpose of her visit any longer. Victoria turned her face fully toward him, looking straight into his tired eyes, and delivered her message without a single trace of hesitation. Without any games, without any long prefaces, and without any unnecessary build-up, I came here today to ask you to marry me. The profound silence that immediately followed her words was not the typical silence of mild surprise, the kind that lasts for a mere 2 seconds, and then dissolves into a nervous laugh or a skeptical question. It was a remarkably heavy, suffocating silence, the specific kind of quiet that seems to occupy physical space in a room and alter the air pressure entirely. David stared at her for what felt like an eternity, searching every line of her beautiful face for some hidden sign of a joke, a cruel piece of irony, or a poorly conceived prank. He found absolutely nothing of the sort. Victoria Foster was looking back at him with the most serious, unwavering expression he had witnessed in many years. "Do you have any idea how old I am?" David finally asked, his voice cracking slightly under the sheer absurdity of the proposition. 33, she answered instantly, without blinking. "And you are fully aware that I am a widower?" he continued, his tone hardening. "I know," she replied calmly. "You know that I own a ranch burdened with an outstanding operational bank loan that is nowhere near being paid off, that I employ only 3 ranch hands, that I have an elderly housekeeper who essentially runs this entire house, and that I have absolutely no habit of receiving social visits," David pressed, stepping closer. "I am fully aware of all of those things," she said softly, her gaze never wavering from his. David rose slowly from his seat, walked heavily to the very edge of the wooden porch, and gripped the railing tightly with both hands, keeping his back turned toward her for a long moment as he tried to process the surreal conversation. "Then you need to explain to me what is truly going on here," he said, his voice laced with deep confusion, "because what you just said to me makes absolutely no logical sense whatsoever." Victoria took a deep breath and began to explain, not with frantic haste or exaggerated drama, but with the exhausted voice of a woman who had been carrying a crushing weight completely alone for months and had finally decided to lay it all out on the table. She spoke openly about her grandfather, Arthur Foster, who had passed away 4 months prior, leaving the entire family in a financial catastrophe that absolutely no one had anticipated. She detailed the astronomical debts her grandfather had quietly accumulated over the course of several years, including massive bank loans, private creditors, and an ancient, forgotten mortgage on the 80 acres of pristine land where her family had lived since she was a young child. "But the debt is not even the most complicated part of the problem," she said, her voice dropping slightly as she looked out over the pastures. "When the lawyers finally opened his will and began the probate process, they discovered an old legal document, a specific agreement that my grandfather had made decades ago with a prominent local creditor of that era. It had been buried deep in the county archives, and absolutely no one in our family knew it existed until now." She explained that within this archaic document, there was a strict, bizarre clause stating that any female heir who wished to assume full ownership of the property in the event of insolvency had to be legally married before the property transfer could be officially recognized by the Regional Land Registry. "It is an incredibly outdated, patriarchal rule from another century," she admitted, shaking her head in frustration, "but our family attorney confirmed that, from a technical standpoint, it still holds absolute legal validity within the current probate case." David turned around slowly to face her, his brow furrowed. "How much time do you have left?" he asked. 62 days, she replied instantly. "And you drove all the way out to my ranch because you honestly believe I am the only man in this entire valley you can trust?" David let out a short, cynical breath, not out of mockery, but in the manner of a man who hears something so unexpected, he simply does not know how to mentally process it. "You do not even know me," he muttered, shaking his head. "I have heard about you for a very long time, David," Victoria responded firmly. "Not from just one person, and not recently, but from many different people over the years. I heard about the man who quietly paid off his neighbor's debt when the bank was about to foreclosure on their land. I heard about the man who hired a struggling ranch hand whom nobody else would employ, giving him a second chance at life. I heard about the man who, when his wife died, did not go searching for quick consolation in the bars, but stayed right here, worked the land, and maintained his honor. That does not qualify me to be anyone's husband," David said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "It qualifies you to be trusted," she answered immediately. David fell completely silent once again, turning his gaze back to the fields where the gentle Montana wind was bending the tall grass in slow, rhythmic waves. He caught a glimpse of Nancy appearing briefly at the kitchen window, peering out curiously at the unexpected visitor before disappearing back into the shadows of the house. But David knew his elderly housekeeper well enough to know she was listening to every single word through the open window. The old woman possessed much sharper hearing than she ever let on. "I am going to need you to leave now," David said after a long, agonizing pause. "Not because I am ignoring your situation, but because I desperately need time to think about everything you have just told me." "I entirely understand," Victoria said softly, picking up her leather bag from the porch floor. She walked down the short wooden steps, but before reaching her car, she turned around to look at him one last time under the fading evening light. "I am not asking you for love, David. I am simply asking you for honesty. If you decide to tell me no, I will deeply respect your choice and never bother you again. But if you choose to say yes, I swear to you that you will never have a single reason to regret it." He offered no reply as she walked away, and she drove off into the dusk. David remained out on the porch for nearly an hour after her car had completely vanished down the long, dusty dirt road, staring blankly at the dark horizon with the strange, unsettling feeling that his predictable life had suddenly changed direction, without his permission. Nay eventually appeared on the porch carrying a plate of warm food that he had not requested, placing it gently on the table. Without looking directly at him, the old woman murmured, "That young lady has the eyes of someone who was raised to endure incredibly difficult things." David did not answer. "Eat before it gets cold," she added quietly before retreating back inside. That night, David did not sleep well, though insomnia was certainly nothing new for him, as he had rarely slept soundly since the tragedy. However, there was a profound difference between the familiar insomnia of grief, the kind accompanied by a dull, aching sorrow, and this entirely new state of mental restlessness that he could not quite define. He lay wide awake in his dark bedroom, staring intently at the dark wooden beams of the ceiling, trying desperately to understand what it was about Victoria Foster's eyes that had disrupted his hard-earned peace. It was not merely her undeniable beauty, because he had long since learned to acknowledge beauty without actually feeling anything at all. It was something entirely different. It was the complete and total absence of deceit or games in her demeanor. She had arrived on his porch, laid her entire life and vulnerability out in the open, and made absolutely no attempt to disguise her desperation with calculated tears or superficial seduction. She had been more direct with him than almost anyone else had ever been in his entire life, and that fact bothered him deeply. David had painstakingly constructed a fragile, quiet peace over the past 3 years, based on the firm conviction that nothing could ever disturb his isolation again, yet this woman had managed to shake that foundation in a matter of minutes. The following morning, David called for Robert, his oldest and most trusted ranch hand, a wise man in his late 50s who had worked alongside David's father and knew every family in the county. "Do you know anything about the Foster family over in the eastern part of the valley?" David asked casually while the two men drank their morning coffee outside the main equipment barn. Robert raised a graying eyebrow, holding his warm mug tightly. "I know them by reputation," Robert replied slowly. "Old Arthur Foster was a thoroughly good man. but he always lived far beyond his financial means. The family possesses a beautiful piece of land, but their debts are rumored to be significantly larger than the value of the land itself. The youngest granddaughter, Victoria, is said to be completely different from her grandfather, hardworking, incredibly honest, but she has been in a severe financial bind since he passed. Is there anyone in the valley who has a specific interest in acquiring their property? David inquired, keeping his voice neutral. Robert lowered his voice significantly, not out of any real necessity, but out of a lifelong habit of rural caution. There absolutely is, Robert murmured. Frank Duncan has been circling that property like a vulture for the past year. He is the wealthy man who purchased the massive acreage on the other side of the creek last winter, a man rumored to deal in dirty money mixed with shady cattle contracts. If the Foster family fails to resolve their probate situation quickly, Frank will undoubtedly swoop in with an aggressive offer the exact moment their vulnerability peaks. David drank his black coffee very slowly, digesting the information. And what about an old marriage clause in a property deed? Have you ever heard of such a thing around here? I actually have, Robert nodded seriously. The older parts of this territory still have those bizarre, archaic legal documents buried in the county registry. Sometimes they still hold legal weight, depending entirely on the specific judge and the nature of the original contract. But they can certainly create a massive nightmare problem during a property probate. David said nothing more, and Robert did not pry further. The two men simply stood there staring out at the vast pasture for a long time, as men of the land often do, when there is a heavy matter weighing on their minds, but neither wishes to be the first to speak it aloud. 3 days later, Victoria returned to the ranch, but this time she did not arrive in the late afternoon. She appeared in the early morning just as David was saddling his horse. She was leaning quietly against her car near the front gate, waiting patiently for him to notice her. "I did not come here today to pressure you for an answer," she said quickly before he could speak a single word. "I came because I felt it was only fair that you knew more about who I actually am before you. Make your final decision." David dismounted slowly, looping the leather reins over a wooden post. "Go ahead, I am listening," he said. She began to tell him her story, explaining that she had studied business administration at a university in the city, but had immediately returned home to care for her grandfather when his health began to fail. She had completely taken over the family accounts the moment she realized the old man was no longer capable of managing them rationally. She revealed that she was the one who personally managed the small organic garden, negotiated directly with the wholesale buyers, and had recently leased out a portion of their pasture to supplement their dwindling income. She admitted that the men who occasionally pursued her in town did not truly know her. They merely saw a pretty face and invented the rest. She confessed she had tried to open her heart to someone 2 years ago, but it had ended so poorly she was not yet ready to share the painful details. "I am not asking for your pity," she concluded firmly. "I am simply giving you context, because whatever your answer is, I want it to be an answer given to the real me, not to some false idea of who you think I am." David remained completely silent for a few moments, processing her honesty. "Are you aware that my mother-in-law, Clara, lives only 6 miles down the road from this very spot?" he asked quietly. "I am aware," Victoria replied. "Do you know that she still visits her daughter's grave every single week, and that she views this entire ranch as a living monument to Lauren's memory?" David pressed. "I know that as well," she said softly. "And do you realize that if I accept your proposal, she will view this arrangement as an absolute betrayal of her daughter?" Victoria looked directly into his eyes with an unwavering firmness. "I know she will, David, and it is completely out of my power to change how she feels. But it is entirely within your power to decide whether you are going to live her life or your own." Those sharp words cut much deeper into David's chest than he ever anticipated, not because they were cruel, but because they carried an undeniable truth. He had spent the last 3 years pretending that the boundary between his own life and Clara's deep, consuming grief did not exist, allowing her sorrow to dictate his isolation. "I will give you my final answer this coming Friday," David said, his tone resolute. "I will be right here on Friday morning." Victoria responded directly before turning back to her car and driving away. On Wednesday morning, without any advanced planning, and without mentioning it to a soul, David drove out to the quiet cemetery on the hill. It was not a frequent habit of his anymore. He had visited the grave constantly during the first year of his loss, but had eventually spaced out his visits, realizing he was going out of a sense of obligation rather than pure remembrance. He stood silently before Lauren's elegant headstone, holding his cowboy hat in his hands as the cool mountain wind rustled the artificial flowers Clara had recently placed there. He did not speak aloud, for he was not a man to talk to himself in public, but his mind was flooded with vivid memories of his late wife. He remembered her exactly as she had been in real life, not the flawless, saintly version that grief tends to artificially create over time, but the real Lauren. The woman who argued with him over trivial things, who possessed the stubborn flaw of holding on to grudges a bit too long, but who had also been the very first person to truly believe he could save this ranch when everyone else predicted failure. He thought about how deeply good she had been to him, how immensely happy they had been, and how that happiness had been brutally stolen away in a manner that would never make sense. Then he remembered something profound she had told him during a foolish argument that had lasted for 3 whole days, when he had threatened in a fit of rage to leave and never come back. She had stopped dead in the middle of the kitchen, looked at him with her fierce eyes, and said, "David, you are the exact type of man who will completely destroy his own life out of pure pride if you do not learn to accept what life offers you." He had been furious back then, but her words had echoed in his mind for years. On Thursday morning, long before the sun had completely cleared the eastern mountain peaks, Clara arrived at the ranch entirely unannounced. She was a petite, 62-year-old woman with her graying hair always pinned back in a tight bun, and she possessed a specific way of walking through his front door that made it clear she still considered this house partially her own, which was true in many ways, as she had helped decorate it. "I heard a rumor in town that you have been receiving a regular visitor," she said sharply, sitting down heavily at the kitchen table while Nancy, without being asked, quietly poured her a fresh cup of coffee. "Word travels fast in a small valley," David replied cautiously, leaning against the counter. "David," Clara said, her voice dropping into the stern tone she reserved for serious matters, "that foster girl is simply using you to save her own skin. You do not need to be an expert on human nature to see right through her intentions. You are seeing a betrayal where there is actually just a person in a desperate situation, Clara," David said softly, choosing his words with immense care. Clara fell silent for a few seconds, her hands trembling slightly around her coffee mug. "My daughter loved you with all her heart, David," she whispered. "I know she did," he replied, "and you loved her just as much, did you not?" She pressed, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, I did," David said. "Then how can you possibly sit here and tell me you are actually considering this?" "Clara," David interrupted her, his voice gentle, but filled with an absolute unbreakable firmness. "Lauren died 3 years ago, and she was the most honest, realistic person I have ever known in my life. You know better than anyone else that she was absolutely not the kind of woman who would want me to remain frozen in time forever just to prove my love for her." Clara's eyes shone with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall in front of him. "You do not even know this woman, David," she said defensively. "I do not know her well yet," he agreed openly, "but I am paying very close attention to who she is." The difficult conversation ended right there, not with a mutual reconciliation and not with an angry shout, but with that heavy, loaded silence that exists between two people who deeply respect each other but simply cannot yield a single inch. On Friday morning, Victoria arrived at the ranch at the exact hour they had agreed upon, and this time David was waiting for her out on the front porch. Unlike her previous visits, where she had caught him in the middle of physical labor, he was dressed neatly and sitting, with the composed posture of a man who had thoroughly made up his mind and was entirely prepared to communicate his terms. She walked up the wooden steps of the porch and stood directly in front of him, her breath caught in her throat as she waited for him to speak. I accept your proposal, Victoria, David said calmly. But I need you to completely understand something before we take a single step forward. Victoria nodded, waiting intently for his conditions. We are going to do this properly, David stated firmly. This will not be a fake marriage. It will not be a mere facade, and it will not exist solely on a piece of legal paper. If we are going to sign our names to a marriage license, it will be because we both fundamentally respect what that commitment means. You will move into this house, you will help me with whatever is needed on your own property, and we will conduct ourselves like mature adults who made a conscious, deliberate choice. No games, no secrets, and absolutely no using one another as a temporary stepping stone. I agree to every single one of those terms, Victoria said without a moment of hesitation. And there is one more thing, David continued, his voice dropping slightly. I have absolutely no idea what will happen between us in the future. I do not know if this arrangement will simply be what you need to save your land before we eventually go our separate ways, or if it will turn into something else entirely. But I promise you that I will never lie to you about what I am feeling, nor will I ever pretend to feel something just to tell you what you want to hear. I would never expect anything less from you, Victoria replied softly. David rose from his chair and extended his right hand toward her. She looked at his large, calloused hand for a brief second, before reaching out and shaking it with a remarkably firm, confident grip. It was at that exact emotional moment that Nancy pointedly opened the kitchen window, peered out at the two of them with a knowing look, made the familiar clicking sound with her tongue that she always made when she believed she knew more than everyone else, and shut the window firmly. What neither David nor Victoria realized at that moment was that the entire Bitterroot Valley was already talking about them. A small, rural valley like theirs lived and breathed on neighborly gossip, possessing an efficiency that was almost industrial in its speed. A piece of news could leave one front porch and reach the 10th house down the road before the person who started it had even closed their front gate. The wild rumor that Victoria Foster had visited David Vance's secluded ranch not once, but 3 separate times, had circulated through the community with the speed and enthusiasm of wildfire. Down at Harvey's local pharmacy, over the counter at the butcher shop, in the slow-moving line at the town bank, and even during the brief intermission of Sunday church services, their names were on everyone's lips. The various versions of the story fluctuated with a level of creativity that would have been highly admirable in any other context. There were those who maliciously claimed that Victoria was completely desperate and had offered David a massive sum of money, while others insisted David was being foolishly deceived by a cunning woman who merely needed a respectable man's name on a legal document. Within David's small circle of friends, which was exceptionally small because he had never been a man who enjoyed large social gatherings, the reaction to the news was much more direct. Samuel Lewis, who owned the prosperous ranch directly adjacent to David's property and was the closest thing to a best friend David had left, appeared at the barn on Saturday morning under the obvious pretext of borrowing a post-hole digger he had absolutely no actual use for. "All right, you need to tell me what is going on right now," Samuel said, leaning his heavy hands against the workbench and dropping his poorly fabricated excuse entirely. "There is nothing to tell," David replied smoothly, refusing to look up from the leather saddle he was oiling. "David, come on," Samuel pressed, shaking his head. "I heard directly from my wife, who heard it from her sister, who works down at the county courthouse, that you two have already filed the official paperwork for a marriage license." David turned around slowly, looking his friend dead in the eye. "The bureaucracy in this county moves incredibly fast when it wants to," David said with a faint, humorless half-smile. "Fast?" Samuel echoed loudly. "You are telling me that you are suddenly getting married to Victoria Foster, and you think the most appropriate description is that the courthouse moves fast?" "I am not trying to argue with your choice, David. I am just trying to understand it. You spent the last 3 years telling me you wanted to be left completely alone, that this ranch was more than enough for you, and I genuinely believed you. What changed?" David fell silent for a moment, staring down at the leather in his hands. Now I am making a different choice, Samuel, he said quietly. Samuel observed him for a long time, searching for any sign that his friend had completely lost his mind, but finding only resolution. "Are you doing all right?" Samuel asked with genuine concern. "I am," David replied firmly. "Better than I was a week ago." Samuel nodded, accepting the boundary, and left without another word. The situation regarding Frank Duncan, however, was far from being resolved so easily. Frank was a wealthy, predatory 52-year-old man who had built his vast fortune through a highly questionable combination of large-scale cattle speculation and real estate deals that never seemed entirely transparent when closely examined. He was the specific type of local figure who made sure to appear at every single community event, offering a crushing handshake and a broad smile that never quite reached his cold eyes, memorizing everyone's name to use it as a social weapon later on. He had tried to approach Victoria multiple times following her grandfather's passing, offering what he smoothly referred to as generous financial assistance to resolve her family's probate issues. However, those generous conditions, when read with close legal scrutiny, placed the Foster family's historic land up as collateral under terms that practically guaranteed a total transfer of ownership to Frank at the very first sign of a missed payment. Victoria had firmly rejected his offers every single time, and Frank had merely smiled, confidently believing that time and financial pressure were entirely on his side. When the sudden news of her impending marriage to David Vance finally reached Frank's ears, his smile did not fade, but a dangerous, calculating look appeared in his eyes. He immediately placed a phone call to Henry Foster, a distant, disgruntled cousin of Victoria's, who held a very small percentage of interest in the estate, but possessed a loud voice. "Have you seen what your clever cousin is doing with the family land?" Frank asked smoothly over the phone line. "I saw," Henry replied bitterly. "And do you honestly consider that to be a normal transaction? Sarah marrying a reclusive man she barely knows just to bypass a legal clause?" Frank pressed, planting the seed of doubt. "Normal? Probably not," Henry admitted. "But she never consults me about any of her decisions anyway. You have a legal stake in that probate, Henry, which means you have a voice in court. If that marriage can be proven to be fraudulent, or if we can show it was entered into under extreme economic duress or highly duplicitous circumstances, a judge could easily throw it out, and the land would be wide open again." There was a long pause on the line. "What exactly are you suggesting, Frank?" Henry asked. "I am suggesting you pay very close attention to them. Keep your eyes wide open, and if anything looks irregular, let me know immediately." Neither Victoria nor David had had any idea that this conversation had taken place as they sat together at a small wooden desk inside the Bitterroot Valley clerk's office, signing the official marriage paperwork with a level of solemn gravity that the young clerk behind the counter found entirely unusual. There was absolutely no romantic atmosphere in the room, no holding of hands, and none of the nervous, giddy happiness that the clerk typically witnessed in young couples. There were simply two sensible adults executing a serious agreement with the dignity it deserved, which, in its own unique way, felt far more honest than most marriages that passed through that office. On the long drive back to the ranch, sitting inside Victoria's truck, because David's old vehicle was suffering from a broken transmission he had not yet found time to fix, the two of them remained in total silence for several miles. It was a remarkably comfortable silence, not the awkward, strained quiet of two strangers who had nothing to say, but the calm atmosphere of two people who were gradually learning to gauge the physical and emotional space they occupied next to one another. "I have a question for you," David said quietly, breaking the silence as he stared out at the passing fence lines. "Go ahead and ask," Victoria replied, keeping her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Before you ultimately decided to drive out to my ranch and pitch this idea, did you consider asking anyone else in this valley?" Victoria paused for a long second before answering honestly. "I considered 3 other men initially. 2 of them I dismissed almost immediately because I realized they would find a way to maliciously exploit the situation for their own gain, even if they did not realize it at first. The 3rd man I actually went to visit in person. He listened to my entire situation told me he needed a night to think about it, and then sent me a cold text message the next morning saying he refused to get involved in a complicated family land dispute. So I was your fourth choice, David noted, his expression unreadable. You were the man I should have approached first, David, she confessed softly. But I was terrified of coming to you. Terrified of what? He asked. Terrified that you would say no without even giving me a single chance to explain the truth. David looked out the window, a faint smile touching his lips. I almost did, he admitted. I know, she said quietly, but you didn't. The truck pulled up to the ranch house, and David told her she could begin moving her belongings into the large empty guest room the very next day. Victoria arrived with her belongings early the following morning, and just as she had indicated, she did not bring much with her. Only one large leather suitcase, 2 cardboard boxes of books and records, and a pair of small potted green plants that she gently explained she simply could not bear to leave behind. Nancy stood on the porch, watching with an intensely critical eye as the boxes were carried inside, silently evaluating the new additions, before ultimately deciding the plants were acceptable and could stay. Victoria did not turn the moving process into a dramatic ceremony. She did not ask for any assistance beyond what was absolutely necessary, and she arranged her new room with a quiet efficiency that David noticed when walking past the hallway. Their daily cohabitation began without any grand fanfare or awkward tension. To David's immense surprise, Victoria woke up incredibly early every single day, proving she was well accustomed to the grueling hours of rural life rather than the soft routines of the city. And she was often down in the kitchen brewing a fresh pot of coffee before Nancy had even made it downstairs. She did not speak merely to fill the silence, and she never forced superficial conversations, a specific trait that David appreciated far more than he ever expected to. During those initial weeks, they treated each other with a polite, measured distance, sharing meals because it was practical, and discussing only the daily operational needs of the ranch. One afternoon, while they were walking along the western perimeter of the pasture, Victoria began asking incredibly detailed questions about the ranch's complex irrigation system, showing a genuine interest that was impossible to fake. As David explained the layout, she asked 2 highly specific questions regarding water rights and seasonal flow management that revealed she understood agricultural administration far better than almost anyone he had spoken to in years. Did you learn all of this from books, or where did that knowledge come from? David asked, looking at her with newfound respect. My grandfather taught me almost everything since I was a little girl, she explained, her voice softening at the memory. But I chose to study business in college because I wanted to understand the structural logic behind what he was doing. He was a brilliant teacher when it came to working the land, but the financial aspect was where he ultimately failed, not out of any malice, but out of stubborn pride. He truly believed he could fix every problem alone and hid the debts until they became too massive to handle. That is the classic pride of an old-school rancher, David remarked quietly, staring straight ahead. It is, Victoria agreed completely, turning her head to look at him intently. Do you suffer from that same kind of pride, David? I absolutely do, he admitted honestly, without any hint of defensiveness. But I am actively working on it. A small, beautiful smile appeared on Victoria's face. Not a wide, dramatic grin, but one of those subtle, genuine smiles that surface when someone unexpectedly tells the absolute truth. David noticed the smile, felt a strange warmth in his chest, and quickly looked back at the trail. But he catalogued the moment deeply in his mind. The inevitable trouble with her cousin Henry Foster surfaced during their 3rd week of marriage. Victoria received a tense phone call on a Tuesday morning that left her noticeably quiet and withdrawn for the rest of the day. And that evening, after Nancy had retired to her quarters, she sat alone out on the dark porch. David, who had already begun to recognize her subtle behavioral patterns, walked out and sat down in the adjacent rocking chair. Henry officially filed a formal legal contestation against the probate estate this morning, she said quietly, without waiting for him to prompt her. What exactly is he contesting? David asked, his brow furrowing in anger. He is legally challenging the validity of our marriage clause, she explained, her voice trembling slightly with exhaustion. His lawyer is arguing that the marriage was entered into under highly coercive conditions, claiming I was in a position of extreme financial vulnerability, and that the marriage is essentially a sham contract that should be declared null and void by the court. David remained perfectly still, his mind racing. "Someone is funding him, Victoria," he said flatly. "Henry does not have the money to hire a high-powered estate attorney on his own. It has to be Frank Duncan." "I know," she sighed, rubbing her temples. "I have a general lawyer in town, but he doesn't specialize in complex land disputes. I honestly don't know if he can handle this." "I know the exact man we need," David said reassuringly. "He handled a brutal land grab case for a neighbor of mine a few years ago. He is based in the city, but he travels here frequently. I will call him tomorrow morning." Victoria looked at him, her eyes wide with gratitude. "You don't have to do this, David. This is my family's mess. You live under my roof now, Victoria," David said with an unbreakable calmness. "The moment we signed that paperwork, your problems became my problems. It is as simple as that." Howard, the high-powered land attorney David had summoned, arrived at the ranch 2 days later. He was a sharp, thin man in his mid-40s, wearing precise wire-rimmed glasses and carrying a faded leather briefcase that bore the distinct look of a man who had spent decades defending generational family lands. He spent the entire morning sitting at the dining room table, meticulously reviewing every single property deed, will, and financial statement, asking Victoria incredibly sharp questions, with the clinical precision of a surgeon. "The marriage clause is definitely archaic, but it is technically valid under current state law," Howard concluded, removing his glasses. "What we must definitively prove in court is that this marriage was not entered into under coaction or fraud. We need clear evidence that this is a voluntary, conscious relationship between two consenting adults." "We have plenty of witnesses for that," David stated firmly, leaning against the doorframe. "The entire town saw her drive out here willingly. The entire town will have 10 different malicious versions of why she came here, depending on who you ask," Howard countered pragmatically. "We do not need gossip. We need the right people to stand up and tell the truth." Robert was the very first person to step forward the moment David explained the legal situation, offering his support without being asked. "I have been here since day one," the old ranch hand said fiercely. "I know exactly what I saw, and if I need to tell a judge the truth, I will do it gladly." Nancy appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Count me in as well," she said sharply. "I may be old, but my eyes and ears work perfectly fine, and I know real honesty when I see it." Samuel Lewis also agreed to testify after David sat down with him and finally explained the entire situation. "You should have told me everything from the start, David," Samuel said, slapping him on the shoulder. "I was still processing it myself," David admitted. "Well, you don't have to carry it alone anymore. I've got your back." As the formal legal process intensified over the next month, Frank Duncan confidently assumed that the immense public pressure and legal costs would quickly break David's resolve, forcing Victoria into a desperate negotiation. However, Frank had completely failed to calculate the specific, legendary stubbornness of David Vance, a silent, enduring resolve that never manifested in loud speeches, but in consistent, immovable action. David attended every single deposition, reviewed every legal brief with Howard, and never showed a single trace of doubt or retreat. Meanwhile, Victoria had quietly transformed the chaotic financial records of David's ranch, organizing his outstanding loans and cattle contracts with a brilliant system that was vastly superior to anything he had used before, working silently without demanding any praise. One evening, a massive summer thunderstorm struck the Bitterroot Valley without warning, transforming the calm night into a chaotic battle against the elements, as ferocious winds began tearing a section of the metal roof off the main hay barn. When David woke to the sound of tearing metal and rushed out into the pouring rain, he was stunned to find Victoria already out there in a heavy yellow raincoat, working alongside Robert in the mud to secure the structural beams. He immediately rushed into the fray, and for 2 grueling hours, the three of them fought the storm together. Afterward, soaked to the bone and catching their breath inside the barn entryway, Robert looked over at David, smiled warmly, and muttered a simple phrase, "Good choice, boss." David did not verbally respond, but the look of profound gratitude he cast toward Victoria said more than enough. The formal court hearing took place at the county courthouse on the second Monday of the following month. Howard presented their defense with flawless, airtight logic, systematically dismantling Henry's weak arguments piece by piece, while the honest testimonies of Robert, Nancy, and Samuel made it undeniably clear that the marriage was an honorable mutual agreement. The presiding judge, an old-fashioned man of the valley who understood the sacred weight of land ownership and traditional contracts, ruled decisively in Victoria's favor, declaring there was absolutely no legal basis to contest the marriage or the inheritance. The historic Foster property was officially confirmed, with Victoria named as the sole, undisputed titleholder. Henry fled the courthouse without uttering a word, while Frank Duncan, who had stayed behind the scenes, simply smiled coldly when he received the news via telephone, mentally archiving the loss and immediately plotting his next financial move. As they stepped out onto the concrete steps of the county courthouse, Victoria stopped completely, staring out at the quiet, familiar streets of the small town as a wave of immense relief washed over her. "It is finally over," she whispered, her shoulders dropping. "The legal part of it is definitely over," David replied quietly, adjusting his cowboy hat as he looked down at her. Victoria turned her head, trying to decipher the unreadable expression on his weathered face. "What exactly do you mean by that, David?" she asked, her heart beating slightly faster. David looked at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a deep, steady intensity. "I mean that we have a lot more to talk about now that the paperwork is settled, and it has nothing to do with judges or property deeds." A beautiful, soft expression appeared on Victoria's face, an expression of profound relief, like a person who had been terrified a door would remain permanently locked, only to find it was already open. 3 weeks later, following a sudden invitation from Clara, they drove down the valley for Sunday lunch. The meal was initially filled with that polite, rigid tension familiar to rural families, where the food is excellent but a silent, diplomatic war is fought in every long pause. Clara observed Victoria with the hypercritical eye of a grieving mother, evaluating her every word, but Victoria refused to put on a superficial performance to win her approval. During a particularly heavy silence at the table, Victoria looked directly at Clara and spoke from the absolute depths of her heart. "Clara, I want you to know that I did not come into David's life with any intention of replacing Lauren. That would be completely impossible, even if I were foolish enough to try. Lauren is an indelible part of David's history, and she always will be. I only hope that, with enough time, you can come to view me simply as a person who is part of what comes next, rather than someone who came to erase what came before." Clara stared at her for a very long time, her eyes welling with emotion, before she finally spoke in a quiet, trembling voice. "You speak with real honor, young lady. My daughter would have respected that." Coming from Clara, that statement was a monumental victory. On the bumpy drive back to the ranch, as the truck navigated the deep ruts of the dirt road, David kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. "She is going to be completely fine, Victoria," he said softly. "She just needs time to heal, and she has plenty of it." Victoria nodded silently, looking out the passenger window at the golden evening light filtering through the trees. "David," she said after a few moments, "when we left the courthouse, you said we had more to talk about. Do you remember?" "I remember every single word I say to you," David replied firmly, slowing the truck down as they approached their front gate. "I said it because it is the absolute truth. I am not a man who says things he does not genuinely believe. I am starting to feel that there is much more between us two," she confessed in a whisper. "Then we are standing in the exact same place," he said simply. The beautiful months that followed were defined by a quiet, gradual construction of a shared life, built not on sudden, dramatic, grand gestures, but on the steady accumulation of small, meaningful moments. It was found in the way she always brewed his morning coffee to the exact strength, preferred, and the way he began to naturally consult her on major financial decisions for the ranch because her business mind was vastly superior to his. They discovered a rare, beautiful ability to disagree on daily chores with the ease of two people who had absolutely no desire to win an argument but simply wanted to find the best solution together. One afternoon, when Victoria was facing an aggressive property boundary dispute with a stubborn neighboring landowner, David silently saddled his horse and rode out with her without saying a word, standing firmly by her side until the neighbor ultimately backed down, proving to her that she would never have to face a battle alone again. During the heavy week of Lauren's anniversary, David became noticeably quiet and withdrawn, as the calendar always brought back a wave of inevitable sorrow. Victoria completely understood his grief. She did not attempt to force him out of his quiet state or fill the house with unnecessary noise. Instead, she simply placed a single beautiful wild rose on the kitchen table where he always drank his morning coffee. No note, no grand speech, just a quiet acknowledgement of his pain. David stared at the flower for a long time before finding her in the hallway, looking into her understanding eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You are so welcome, David," she replied softly, and that simple exchange was more than enough to bridge the gap between his past and their present. As time passed, Clara began visiting the ranch with increasing frequency, and one bright Saturday afternoon, she walked through the back door to find Victoria and Nancy completely covered in flour, laughing merrily as they prepared a massive batch of traditional berry pies. Clara stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the warmth and life that had returned to the kitchen that had been dark and silent for 3 long years. Victoria caught her eye and offered a warm, non-judgmental smile, inviting her into the space. Clara quietly hung her sweater on the wall hook, walked over to the counter, and whispered, "The crust turns out much flaker if you work the butter in a bit slower at the start." By the time David returned from the fields that evening, the 3 women were sitting together, sharing stories in an atmosphere that felt deeply whole. Frank Duncan's malicious rumors eventually died out completely, as small-town gossip always does when it fails to find fresh fuel, and the valley naturally moved on to newer, more exciting scandals. It was on a gorgeous, golden afternoon in late June, with the sun casting long shadows across the valley and the wind carrying the rich, sweet scent of fresh rain, that David and Victoria found themselves working side by side to repair the final section of the perimeter fence. David was holding the heavy wire taut while Victoria skillfully hammered the metal staples into the wooden post with practiced precision. Suddenly, David stopped working entirely, dropping his tools to his side and turning his full attention to her. Victoria noticed the sudden pause, lowering her hammer and looking up at him with a curious expression. "What is it, David? Did I miss a spot?" she asked. David stared at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a profound emotion he had locked away for years. "Victoria, when you first walked onto my porch months ago to propose this arrangement, you explicitly told me you were not asking for love, but simply for honesty. I need you to know that our original paper agreement is officially over. Your family's land is entirely safe, the legal battles are won, and you do not owe me a single thing out of obligation or duty." Victoria fell completely silent, her heart pounding against her ribs as she waited for his next words. "What exactly are you trying to tell me, David?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I am telling you that what is keeping you in this house is no longer a legal contract," David said, his voice thick with emotion as he stepped closer to her. "It is something else entirely." "What kind of thing?" she pressed, her eyes searching his. "The kind of thing that stays forever," he said honestly. Victoria slowly lowered her hammer to the ground, her eyes filling with tears of pure happiness. "I have been feeling that exact same thing for a very long time, David," she confessed. "I have too," he admitted, "but I needed to be absolutely certain before I spoke it aloud, and I am completely certain now." He extended his hand, not for a formal business handshake, but to gently cup her face and draw her into a deep, loving embrace under the vast Montana sky. Life, in its ultimate wisdom, has a profound way of teaching us that our greatest transformations often arrive disguised as our deepest disruptions. forcing us to realize that the human heart possesses a remarkable, almost infinite capacity to rebuild itself from the ashes of total devastation. For those who have accumulated the invaluable wealth of decades of living, this truth resonates with a deep, familiar echo because growing older is fundamentally an ongoing lesson in the delicate art of letting go while simultaneously maintaining the courage to welcome what lies ahead. We often spend the middle years of our existence under the foolish illusion that we can completely control the narrative of our lives, meticulously building high walls of predictability and pride around our vulnerabilities to protect ourselves from the inevitable pain of loss. We transform our grief into sacred, frozen monuments, mistakenly believing that remaining entirely stationary in our sorrow is the only authentic way to honor the memories of what we have lost, completely failing to see that life is a fluid, moving current that strictly forbids stagnation. True emotional maturity is the hard-earned understanding that accepting a new chapter of happiness does not require the erasure or betrayal of the chapters that came before, but rather allows them to serve as a beautiful foundational soil from which new life can gracefully emerge. When we lose something or someone of immense value, the initial instinct of our fragile ego is to close the gates entirely, to declare that our time for receiving affection, purpose, and companionship has officially drawn to a permanent close. Yet, the universe frequently sends unexpected messengers into our lives. Individuals who arrive not with grand, superficial promises of romantic illusion, but with the raw, grounded medicine of absolute honesty, necessity, and shared vulnerability. It takes immense internal strength to lower our heavy defenses when these moments arrive, to admit that the quiet solitude we proudly mislabeled as peace was actually just a comfortable form of isolation. A house only truly transforms back into a living home when we allow the fresh air of truth, mutual respect, and collaborative effort to circulate freely through its forgotten rooms, replacing the dusty silence of the past with the vibrant, messy noise of the present. Ultimately, the most enduring structures of human connection are never built on the fragile foundations of fleeting, youthful passion, but are painstakingly constructed through the daily, ordinary choices of showing up for one another, sharing the heavy weights of life's unpredictable storms, and offering a safe harbor where defenses are no longer necessary. As the long evening shadows naturally lengthen across the landscapes of our lives, we come to understand that the opinions, rumors, and superficial judgments of the outside world occupy an incredibly small, insignificant amount of space compared to the profound reality of a life lived with absolute integrity. We realize, with a quiet smile, that it is never too late to accept the unexpected gifts that life chooses to lay at our feet, and that finding a genuine place to belong is simply a matter of having the profound courage to open the gate and let love back inside.